What if the fear that has followed you your entire life is not a permanent condition of reality, but a signal that you have not yet aligned your mind with the higher intelligence that governs all success, all order, all power, and all destiny? Fear is not born in the world outside you. It is conceived in the silent chambers of the mind, nourished by uncertainty and sustained by the absence of direction. Napoleon Hill understood this with unsettling clarity. He knew that fear is not an enemy that attacks from the outside, but a force that rises from within when the mind is disconnected from purpose, from faith, from the unseen intelligence that animates life itself. When the human mind drifts without a definite aim, fear rushes in to fill the vacuum. When desire weakens, fear grows bold. When faith dissolves, fear assumes authority. This is not theology. This is psychological law. Fear is the natural byproduct of mental disorder, of a mind that has not submitted itself to a guiding principle greater than impulse, emotion, or circumstance. God's guidance, as Hill understood it, was never a mystical escape from effort. It was alignment. It was the disciplined tuning of the human mind to the frequency of infinite intelligence. He called it many names, but the principle was singular. There exists a higher order of intelligence that responds to faith, clarity, decisiveness, and disciplined thought. When a person consciously aligns their mental life with this intelligence, fear loses its authority, not because danger disappears, but because fear no longer commands the mind. The person becomes inwardly governed, not outwardly ruled. Most people live in quiet submission to fear without ever realizing it. They call it caution, they call it realism, they call it humility. But Hill exposed the truth with ruthless precision. Fear is the most destructive habit of thought known to man. It paralyzes initiative, it poisons imagination, it erodes decision. It weakens persistence. It disguises itself as logic while quietly dismantling potential. And the tragedy is not that fear exists, but that it is accepted as natural. Fear is not natural to a mind that knows its purpose and trusts its source. God's guidance begins where fear ends, and fear ends where definiteness of purpose begins. A drifting mind is a fearful mind. A mind without a clear aim becomes hypersensitive to uncertainty. It overreacts to circumstance. It magnifies risk. It invents catastrophe. But when a person defines a purpose so clearly that it becomes an inner command, fear begins to dissolve, not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. Purpose organizes thought. It disciplines imagination. It gives direction to emotion. And when purpose is anchored in faith and a higher intelligence, fear has no ground to stand on. Faith in Hill's philosophy was not belief without evidence. It was belief that creates evidence. It was the mental state produced when thought is repeated with conviction, when autosuggestion programs the subconscious mind to accept a chosen reality as inevitable. Fear operates the same way, but in reverse. Fear is faith in failure. Fear is belief in limitation reinforced by repetition. Fear is autosuggestion run wild without conscious control. When God's guidance enters the mind, it does not eliminate emotion, it reorders it. Faith becomes dominant. Fear becomes subordinate. The human mind cannot serve two masters. It cannot be guided by faith and ruled by fear simultaneously. One must dominate, and whichever one dominates determines destiny. Hill observed this pattern repeatedly among those he studied. Those who surrendered their mental life to a higher guiding principle exhibited a calm persistence that could not be explained by circumstance. They were not fearless in the absence of danger. They were fearless in the presence of meaning. They had something greater than fear directing their actions. God's guidance is not passive reassurance. It is active discipline. It demands control of thought. It demands mastery of imagination. It demands the refusal to entertain mental images that contradict one's purpose. Fear thrives in undisciplined imagination. It paints vivid pictures of loss, humiliation, failure, and pain. But imagination, when harnessed by faith, becomes the most powerful tool for success. The same faculty that creates fear can create courage. The same mental screen that projects disaster can project destiny. The difference lies in guidance. Hill understood that the subconscious mind does not discriminate. It accepts whatever is impressed upon it with emotional intensity. Fear impresses itself through repetition of negative expectation. Faith impresses itself through repetition of positive conviction. God's guidance operates through the law of autosuggestion. When a person repeatedly affirms alignment with higher intelligence, when they mentally rehearse success not as wish but as expectation, the subconscious begins to reorganize behavior, perception, and response. Fear loses its emotional charge. It becomes information, not authority. The invisible mental forces Hill spoke of are not abstract. They are precise, responsive, and relentless. Thought is energy. Emotion amplifies it. Repetition embeds it. The subconscious executes it, and the environment responds accordingly. Fear sends out a signal of retreat. Faith sends out a signal of command. God's guidance is the highest form of mental command, because it aligns the individual will with universal law. When that alignment occurs, effort becomes focused, persistence becomes natural, and fear becomes irrelevant. Fear is always rooted in the future. It imagines outcomes that have not occurred and assigns them emotional certainty. God's guidance anchors the mind in principle rather than prediction. It teaches the mind to act in accordance with law rather than speculation. The person guided by higher intelligence does not ask whether they will succeed. They ask how faithfully they will execute their purpose. Fear asks, "What if?" Faith asks, "What must be done?" One weakens action, the other demands it. Self-discipline is the bridge between guidance and freedom from fear. Without discipline, faith remains sentiment. Without discipline, belief dissolves under pressure. Hill emphasized that self-discipline is not restriction but liberation. It frees the mind from emotional chaos. It prevents fear from hijacking decision-making. It enforces consistency of thought. When a person disciplines their inner dialogue, fear has nowhere to hide. It cannot survive sustained scrutiny under reason guided by faith. Decision is the act that fear hates most. Indecision is fear's natural habitat. Hill observed that successful people make decisions quickly and change them slowly. Fearful people do the opposite. God's guidance strengthens decision because it removes the illusion that the individual is acting alone. When one believes they are aligned with higher intelligence, decision becomes an act of obedience rather than risk. Responsibility remains, but fear diminishes because the burden of outcome is shared with principle. Persistence is faith in motion. Fear thrives on delay. It grows stronger the longer action is postponed. But persistence, guided by purpose and reinforced by belief, erodes fear through exposure. Each step taken in alignment with purpose weakens fear's credibility. Each obstacle faced and endured reduces its authority. Hill taught that persistence is sustained effort born of faith, not stubbornness born of desperation. When guided by God's intelligence, persistence becomes calm, steady, and unstoppable. Fear mastery is not achieved by confrontation alone. It is achieved by replacement. Fear must be crowded out by a stronger mental force. That force is faith anchored in definiteness of purpose and reinforced by autosuggestion. When the mind is occupied with execution, fear has no attention to feed on. When imagination is directed toward constructive ends, fear cannot project its illusions. God's guidance provides the organizing principle that keeps the mind engaged in creation rather than reaction. The ultimate illusion fear perpetuates is separation. It convinces the individual that they are isolated, unsupported, and alone in a hostile world. Hill shattered this illusion by revealing the principle of infinite intelligence. The mind, when tuned correctly, becomes a receiving station for guidance, insight, and strength beyond personal experience. This is not mystical escapism. It is mental attunement. Those who learn to listen inwardly develop an unshakable composure because they are no longer dependent on external validation or circumstance for direction. God's guidance does not promise ease. It promises coherence. It does not remove challenge. It removes confusion. Fear thrives in confusion. It thrives when the mind does not know what it stands for or where it is going. Clarity is fear's natural enemy. Purpose sharpens clarity. Faith stabilizes it. Discipline enforces it, and action proves it. The person who allows fear to rule their inner world will forever seek safety and find none. The person who allows God's guidance to rule their mind will accept risk and discover peace. This peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of direction. It is the quiet certainty that one's efforts are aligned with law, that persistence is not wasted, that failure is instruction, not condemnation. Fear dissolves when the mind accepts total responsibility for its thoughts. Hill insisted that mastery of self precedes mastery of environment. No external circumstance can produce fear without internal permission. This is not blame, it is empowerment. The moment a person realizes that fear is self-generated, they also realize it can be self-dissolved. God's guidance provides the framework for this realization by shifting authority from emotion to principle. When fear arises, it must be interrogated, not indulged. What purpose does it serve? What belief sustains it? What image fuels it? Faith answers these questions with action. It does not argue with fear, it replaces it. Autosuggestion becomes the tool of reprogramming. The mind is reminded daily, deliberately, and emotionally that it is guided, supported, and aligned. Over time, the subconscious accepts this as fact. Behavior changes, perception sharpens, courage becomes habitual. Imagination, once disciplined, becomes a sacred instrument. It no longer invents disaster, it designs destiny. Hill believed imagination was the workshop of the mind where plans are shaped before they are realized. Fear contaminates this workshop with doubt. God's guidance purifies it with purpose. When imagination is guided by faith, it produces plans that inspire action rather than hesitation. The invisible forces that shape destiny respond to mental states. This is the most uncomfortable truth Hill revealed. Circumstances do not respond to need, they respond to alignment. Fear signals misalignment. Faith signals readiness. God's guidance is the alignment of thought, emotion, and action with universal law. When this alignment is achieved, fear loses relevance. It may appear, but it does not decide. Success, then, is not the conquest of the world, but the conquest of the inner domain. Before wealth appears, before recognition arrives, before achievement becomes visible, fear must be dethroned. And fear is dethroned not by denial, but by devotion to a purpose guided by higher intelligence. The individual becomes internally unified. Thought, emotion, and action move in the same direction. Resistance dissolves. This is the beginning of fearlessness, not recklessness, not arrogance, but a calm, disciplined courage rooted in the knowledge that one's mind is no longer adrift. God's guidance becomes the compass, purpose becomes the destination, faith becomes the fuel, and fear, once the master, becomes nothing more than a signal that alignment must be renewed. This is where the journey truly begins. Fear does not vanish the moment guidance is accepted. It resists, it tests, it attempts to reclaim authority through subtle means. Napoleon Hill understood that fear is persistent precisely because it has been rehearsed for years in the inner theater of the mind. It does not surrender its throne quietly. That is why God's guidance is not a single moment of belief, but a sustained mental discipline. Alignment must be maintained. Faith must be exercised. Purpose must be reaffirmed. Daily, sometimes hourly, especially when circumstances appear to contradict inner conviction. The second stage of inner conquest begins when the individual realizes that fear often disguises itself as reason. It speaks in calm tones. It presents evidence. It quotes past failures. It predicts future disappointment with the voice of logic. Hill warned that fear rarely announces itself openly. It infiltrates the rough rationalization. It convinces the mind that delay is wisdom, that retreat is prudence, that compromise is maturity. And unless the mind is anchored to a higher guiding principle, it will mistake fear for intelligence. God's guidance sharpens discernment. It teaches the mind to distinguish between caution informed by purpose and hesitation born of doubt. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Caution protects purpose. Fear protects comfort. Caution asks whether action aligns with long-term vision. Fear asks whether action threatens immediate security. One preserves destiny. The other preserves mediocrity. Without guidance, the mind cannot tell the difference. With guidance, the difference becomes unmistakable. Hill observed that those who achieved extraordinary success developed an inner dialogue that was disciplined, deliberate, and uncompromising. They did not allow fear-based thoughts to linger unchallenged. They replaced them immediately with thoughts aligned with faith and purpose. This was not positive thinking in the shallow sense, it was mental governance. The mind was treated as a domain to be ruled, not a wilderness to be wandered. God's guidance becomes operational through autosuggestion. The subconscious mind is the executor of belief, not the originator. It accepts instructions through repetition and emotion. Fear instructs the subconscious through anxiety-laden images repeated unconsciously. Faith instructs it through intentional affirmation infused. Why? Conviction. Hill insisted that the subconscious does not respond to logic alone. It responds to feeling. Therefore, faith must be felt, not merely understood. This is why prayer in Hill's philosophy was not pleading but programming. It was not asking God to intervene, but aligning the mind to receive guidance. When prayer becomes an emotional rehearsal of faith, it conditions the subconscious to expect support, clarity, and strength. Fear weakens under this conditioning because it thrives on expectation of loss. Faith thrives on expectation of order. The mind, guided by higher intelligence, begins to experience a shift in perception. Problems no longer appear as threats, but as signals for growth. Obstacles are interpreted as tests of alignment rather than punishments. Failure is reframed as feedback. This reframing is not denial of difficulty, it is redefinition of meaning. Fear depends on catastrophic meaning. God's guidance replaces it with constructive meaning. Persistence becomes the proving ground of faith. Anyone can feel aligned when conditions are favorable. The true test comes when effort yields no immediate reward, when progress is invisible, when doubt whispers that guidance has failed. Hill emphasized that persistence is sustained faith under pressure. It is the refusal to reinterpret delay as denial. Fear interprets delay as evidence of impossibility. Faith interprets delay as preparation. The invisible mental forces Hill described respond to persistence B. Because persistence demonstrates belief, it signals commitment. It proves seriousness of purpose. When effort is sustained despite uncertainty, the subconscious receives a powerful message. This purpose is non-negotiable. Fear loses leverage because it thrives on conditional commitment. When the mind commits fully, fear has nothing to bargain with. God's guidance also demands self-discipline at the emotional level. Emotional reactions are often fear in motion. Anger, jealousy, resentment, impatience, and discouragement frequently originate from threatened self-image. Hill taught that mastery of self requires emotional neutrality in the face of provocation. This neutrality is not indifference, it is control. It prevents fear-based emotions from hijacking behavior. The disciplined mind observes emotion without surrendering to it. When fear manifests as anxiety, the guided mind does not panic. It analyzes. It asks what belief has been activated. It corrects misalignment. This practice gradually weakens fear's reflexive power. The mind learns that fear is not an emergency but a signal, and signals can be interpreted without obedience. Decision-making undergoes a transformation under guidance. Decisions are no longer postponed until certainty appears. Hill was clear that certainty rarely precedes action. It follows it. Fear demands guarantees before movement. Faith moves with incomplete information, trusting guidance to correct course. This trust does not eliminate responsibility. Why? It intensifies it. The individual accepts full accountability for action while trusting higher intelligence to supply insight along the way. Indecision is one of fear's most effective weapons. It drains energy, scatters focus, and erodes confidence. Hill observed that prolonged indecision conditions the subconscious to expect failure. Each delayed decision reinforces doubt. God's guidance counters this by establishing decisiveness as a spiritual and psychological discipline. The guided individual decides promptly, not impulsively, and stands by decisions unless new principles demand revision. Imagination, when liberated from fear, becomes visionary. It begins to anticipate success with the same vividness that fear once reserved for disaster. Hill insisted that imagination must be actively directed. Left unattended, it defaults to fear because fear is emotionally intense and easily accessible. Guided imagination, however, is disciplined imagination. It constructs mental images aligned with purpose and rehearses them until they feel inevitable. These mental rehearsals are not fantasies, they are strategic conditioning. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between vividly imagined experience and real experience. When success is imagined repeatedly with emotional intensity, the subconscious begins to coordinate behavior toward that outcome. Fear weakens because the mind becomes familiar with victory. The unknown becomes known. The threatening future becomes anticipate. D-fulfillment. Faith matures through action. It is not static belief, but dynamic trust. Each action taken in alignment with purpose reinforces faith. Each successful navigation of uncertainty builds internal evidence that guidance is real. Fear loses credibility with each demonstration of competence under pressure. Over time, the individual develops a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. Hill emphasized that the greatest enemy of faith is not doubt but habit. Fear becomes habitual through repetition. It becomes automatic. God's guidance requires the formation of new habits of thought. This is not achieved through occasional inspiration, but through daily mental hygiene. The mind must be fed deliberately with constructive ideas. Negative influences must be restricted. Emotional associations must be managed. Environment plays a subtle role in fear conditioning. Hill warned against association with negative-minded individuals. Fear is contagious. Doubt spreads through conversation, tone, and attitude. The guided individual chooses associations carefully, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. Mental alignment is fragile in its early stages. Exposure to chronic negativity can undo progress quickly. The principle of the master mind, as Hill described it, extends God's guidance into collective intelligence. When individuals align their minds with others who share faith and purpose, fear diminishes further. Isolation amplifies fear. Cooperating diffuses it. The collective reinforces belief. Guidance becomes clearer when reflected through disciplined minds working toward a common aim. Fear often resurfaces during transitions. When old identities dissolve and new ones are not yet solidified, the mind experiences vulnerability. Hill recognized this as a critical phase. God's guidance becomes especially important here. The individual must resist the temptation to retreat into familiar limitation. Growth always destabilizes comfort. Fear interprets this instability as danger. Faith interprets it as expansion. The subconscious mind resists change initially because it seeks familiarity, not truth. Fear is familiar. It has been rehearsed. Faith may feel foreign at first. Persistence is required to recondition the subconscious. Autosuggestion must be applied consistently. Emotional intensity must accompany affirmation. Over time, faith becomes familiar. Fear becomes foreign. Hill taught that the ultimate source of fear is ignorance of self. When individuals do not understand their own mental processes, they become victims of them. God's guidance includes self-knowledge. The guided individual studies their own reactions, patterns, and beliefs. This study is not self-criticism, but self-mastery. Awareness weakens fear because fear thrives in unconsciousness. As self-knowledge deepens, the individual realizes that fear has never protected them from pain. It has only postponed growth. This realization is sobering. It disma. Entails the final justification for fear's authority. God's guidance then assumes full command, not as an external force, but as an internal compass. The mind, guided by higher intelligence, becomes resilient. It absorbs shocks without shattering. It adapts without surrendering purpose. Fear may still appear, but it no longer dictates action. It becomes background noise, not command. The individual moves forward not because fear is absent, but because it is irrelevant. This is the deeper layer of liberation Hill pointed toward. Freedom from fear is not emotional numbness. It is emotional sovereignty. The individual feels fully but is ruled by principle. God's guidance does not dull intensity. It channels it. Desire becomes focused, faith becomes grounded, persistence becomes inevitable. This is the foundation upon which enduring success is built. External achievement without internal alignment collapses under pressure, but internal conquest sustains external progress indefinitely. Fear can no longer derail the journey because the journey is no longer dependent on circumstance. The mind has learned whom it serves, and it is no longer fear. There comes a point in the inner journey where fear no longer shouts, it whispers. This is the most dangerous phase. Loud fear is obvious and can be confronted. Quiet fear disguises itself as wisdom earned through experience. Napoleon Hill warned that at higher levels of development, fear becomes refined. It no longer says you cannot succeed. Ed, it says you should wait. It says the timing is not right. It says there is more preparation to be done. It says restraint is intelligence. And unless the mind is firmly governed by higher guidance, this refined fear can stall a life indefinitely. God's guidance at this stage demands a deeper form of courage. Not the courage to act against resistance, but the courage to act without emotional reassurance. Hill understood that faith matures when it no longer depends on emotional highs. Early faith often feels powerful because it is new. It is energized by novelty and hope. But mature faith operates in silence. It acts without drama. It persists without applause. It moves forward without emotional confirmation. Fear attempts to exploit this silence by suggesting abandonment. Guidance reveals the truth. Silence is stability. The mind that is learning to trust higher intelligence must release its addiction to emotional certainty. Fear feeds on emotional volatility. It thrives when the mind constantly checks how it feels before deciding how to act. God's guidance inverts this relationship. Action is taken according to principle, and emotion follows behavior, not the other way around. This is a critical reversal. Hill emphasized that disciplined action produces disciplined emotion. Waiting for emotion to change before acting is submission to fear. At this level, definiteness of purpose becomes non-negotiable. Purpose is no longer a preference, it is an identity. The individual does not ask whether they feel aligned today. They ask whether today's actions are aligned with purpose. This shift strips fear of its influence because fear cannot argue with identity. When a person knows who they are and what they serve, fear loses its persuasive power. It may appear, but it cannot negotiate. God's guidance becomes most evident through intuition. Hill described intuition as the voice of infinite intelligence communicating through the subconscious. This voice is subtle. It does not shout. It does not argue. It does not plead. It presents impressions, nudges, insights. Fear often dismisses intuition because it lacks immediate proof. But those who learn to trust guidance recognize that intuition becomes clearer with obedience. The more it is followed, the stronger it becomes. Fear demands evidence before action. Guidance reveals evidence after action. This is one of the hardest truths for the undisciplined mind to accept. The guided individual acts on inner conviction even when logic hesitates. This is not recklessness. It is alignment with a deeper logic that operates beyond immediate perception. Hill observed that many breakthroughs occur only after the mind commits beyond visible assurance. Fear collapses at this threshold because it cannot survive commitment. The invisible mental forces Hill spoke of become increasingly responsive as alignment deepens. Opportunities appear that cannot be traced to deliberate effort alone. Encounters occur at precise moments. Insights arrive unannounced. This does not mean effort is replaced. It means effort is amplified. Fear cannot account for these occurrences, so it attempts to dismiss them as coincidence. Faith recognizes pattern. Guidance reveals order. As fear weakens, responsibility increases. This is a paradox few are prepared for. Many believe fear is the burden. In truth, fear is the excuse. When fear no longer dictates behavior, the individual can no longer blame circumstance, hesitation, or uncertainty for inaction. God's guidance removes fear, but it also removes alibis. The individual stands alone with their purpose. This is both liberating and demanding. Hill emphasized that success demands payment in advance. The price is discipline, persistence, and unwavering purpose. Fear attempts to renegotiate this price. It suggests shortcuts, compromises, and partial commitment. Guidance rejects negotiation. It demands total alignment. This is why many retreat at this stage. Not because fear is strong, but because responsibility is absolute. Self-discipline now extends to thought selection at the most subtle level. The guided mind does not merely reject negative thoughts, it rejects unaligned thoughts. Even thoughts that appear harmless but do not serve purpose are dismissed. This level of discipline creates mental clarity that is almost unsettling. The mind becomes quiet. Focus sharpens. Fear, which thrives on mental clutter, finds no environment in which to operate. Hill taught that the subconscious mind becomes an ally when properly conditioned. At this stage, the subconscious begins to anticipate aligned action. It produces impulses toward persistence rather than retreat. It generates emotional reinforcement for discipline rather than indulgence. Fear, once automatic, becomes unnatural. The individual may still recognize fear intellectually, but it no longer triggers the same physiological or emotional response. Faith now functions as a stabilizing force rather than a motivational surge. It holds the mind steady during uncertainty. It prevents overreaction to temporary setbacks. It maintains equilibrium. This steadiness is often mistaken by others for detachment or indifference. In reality, it is deep engagement without emotional chaos. God's guidance produces calm intensity, not agitation. Imagination evolves further. It no longer merely visualizes success. It visualizes process. It rehearses discipline. It anticipates obstacles and calmly prepares responses. Fear imagines disaster without solution. Guided imagination imagines challenge with competence. This difference is decisive. The mind stops being surprised by difficulty. Difficulty becomes expected, even welcomed, as confirmation of growth. Decision-making becomes instinctive, not impulsive, but fluid. The mind no longer freezes at crossroads. It evaluates quickly, chooses decisively, and commits fully. Fear loses its strongest weapon here, indecision. Hill noted that indecision is the gateway through which fear enters. When decisions become habitual and commitment follows immediately, fear is locked out. Persistence now feels less like effort and more like inevitability. The individual no longer asks how long it will take. They act until completion is achieved. Time ceases to be an emotional factor. Delay does not provoke anxiety. Progress is measured internally, not externally. Fear, which relies on time pressure to create urgency and doubt, becomes ineffective. God's guidance also transforms the relationship with failure. Failure no longer threatens identity. It informs strategy. Hill observed that those who are guided do not interpret failure as personal deficiency. They interpret it as misalignment or insufficient persistence. This interpretation prevents fear from attaching emotional weight to setbacks. Without emotional weight, failure cannot intimidate. At this stage, the mind begins to experience a sense of inevitability, not arrogance, not entitlement, but quiet certainty. The individual knows that as long as alignment is maintained, outcome will eventually conform. This certainty is not based on prediction, but on principle. Law is trusted more than circumstance. Fear cannot compete with law. The guided individual becomes increasingly immune to external opinion. Praise does not inflate. Criticism does not destabilize. Fear of judgment dissolves because the standard of evaluation is internal and principled. Hill emphasized that the fear of criticism is one of the most destructive fears. God's guidance neutralizes it by anchoring self-worth in purpose rather than approval. The inner dialogue at this stage becomes sparse but powerful. Words are chosen carefully. Thought is economical. Emotional excess is unnecessary. This mental economy conserves energy for execution. Fear requires constant mental activity to sustain itself. It feeds on rumination, rehearsal, and speculation. When the mind becomes economical, fear starves. The individual now recognizes that fear was never a force to be conquered, but a signal of misalignment. Each time fear appears, it indicates an area where faith must be reinforced, purpose clarified, or discipline renewed. Fear becomes diagnostic rather than obstructive. This reframing completes its loss of authority. Hill believed that this level of mental control marks the transition from effort-driven success to principle-driven success. The individual still works, but work flows. Resistance decreases. Obstacles are navigated with composure. God's guidance is no longer sought anxiously. It is assumed. Trust becomes the default state. This is where inner freedom becomes unmistakable. The individual is no longer driven by avoidance. They are pulled by purpose. Fear cannot motivate or demotivate them. It has been psychologically disarmed. The mind operates under a single command structure: alignment, and alignment sustains momentum even when the path ahead remains unseen. At this stage of the inner transformation, the individual begins to encounter a profound and unsettling realization. Fear did not disappear because the world became safe. It disappeared because the mind became governed. Napoleon Hill understood that this is where most people misinterpret what has happened within them. They assume confidence has replaced fear. In truth, obedience to principle has replaced emotional reaction. The mind has submitted to guidance, and submission is the source of strength that fear can no longer penetrate. God's guidance now operates less as instruction and more as law. The individual no longer negotiates with their purpose. They no longer debate whether to persist. Action flows from identity, not emotion. This creates a psychological solidity that is rare and often misunderstood by others. From the outside, it may appear rigid. From the inside, it feels effortless. Fear cannot operate in a system that does not ask permission to act. Hill taught that this is the point where success becomes internalized. External results may still fluctuate, but inner certainty does not. The person no longer depends on visible progress to maintain belief. Faith has matured into knowing. This knowing is not emotional confidence. It is alignment with principle so deep that doubt has no foothold. Fear thrives on ambiguity. Knowing dissolves ambiguity. The invisible mental forces Hill described now respond with greater consistency. Cause and effect become clearer. The individual notices that disciplined thought produces disciplined outcomes. Emotional control produces strategic clarity. Persistence produces opportunity. These patterns are no longer surprising. They are expected. Fear loses its influence because the mind has learned that obedience to law yields predictable results over time. This stage also exposes a deeper layer of fear that few ever confront, the fear of responsibility for one's own greatness. Hill recognized this fear as one of the most subtle and destructive. When fear of failure fades, fear of success often emerges. Success demands expansion of identity. It demands visibility. It demands leadership. God's guidance challenges the individual to accept these demands without retreat. Fear of success manifests as hesitation at the threshold of completion. The work is nearly done. The vision is almost realized, and suddenly the mind invents reasons to slow down. Hill observed that this hesitation is rooted in fear of judgment, fear of expectation, fear of maintaining a higher standard. Guidance confronts this fear by reminding the individual that purpose was never about comfort. It was about contribution. God's guidance reframes success not as personal elevation, but as fulfillment of duty. This reframing neutralizes fear of success. The individual no longer asks whether they deserve achievement. They ask whether they are willing to honor the responsibility that comes with it. Fear dissolves when success is accepted as obligation rather than end reward. Self-discipline now extends beyond personal behavior into stewardship of influence. The guided individual becomes aware that their mental state affects others. Words carry weight. Presence communicates stability. Fearless minds transmit calm. Hill emphasized that leadership begins with self-mastery. Those who cannot govern themselves cannot guide others. Fearlessness becomes a service, not a display. At this level, imagination operates with moral clarity. It no longer seeks gratification alone. It seeks alignment with constructive purpose. Plans are evaluated not only for feasibility, but for integrity. Fear once distorted imagination by exaggerating risk. Now imagination is disciplined by principle. It asks whether an action aligns with long-term purpose and universal law. This creates a form of strategic wisdom that fear cannot replicate. Decision-making becomes anchored in values rather than outcomes. The individual chooses what is right, according to principle, regardless of immediate consequence. Hill taught that this alignment attracts support from invisible forces because it signals integrity. Fear often compromises values for safety. Guidance refuses compromise. This refusal produces inner strength that cannot be shaken by uncertainty. The relationship with time transforms further. Urgency no longer creates anxiety. Patience no longer creates stagnation. The guided individual understands rhythm. Action is taken decisively, followed by sustained effort, followed by deliberate reflection. Fear disrupts rhythm by creating panic or paralysis. Guidance restores rhythm by aligning effort with natural law. Hill observed that those who reach this stage often experience periods of apparent isolation. Old associations no longer resonate. New ones have not yet formed. This can feel like loneliness, but it is not abandonment. It is transition. Fear attempts to exploit this phase by suggesting separation and loss. Guidance reveals it as refinement. The individual is being prepared for a higher level of responsibility. The subconscious mind at this stage operates with remarkable efficiency. Habits of discipline are deeply embedded. Emotional reactions are minimal. Focus is sustained. Fear finds no habitual pathways to activate. Even unexpected challenges are met with composure. This composure is not suppression. It is confidence in alignment. Hill emphasized that faith at this level becomes impersonal. It is no longer about personal desire alone. It is trust in law. The individual trusts that cause produces effect, that effort aligned with purpose yields results, that guidance is constant even when outcomes are delayed. Fear cannot challenge this trust because it is not based on hope but on demonstrated pattern. The individual now recognizes that fear once served as a substitute for thinking. It provided emotional response where disciplined analysis was absent. With guidance, thinking becomes deliberate and objective. Problems are seated calmly. Solutions are constructed methodically. Fear, which thrives on emotional overwhelm, is displaced by reason infused with faith. God's guidance also deepens humility at this stage. Not humility born of insecurity, but humility born of understanding. The individual recognizes that personal ability alone did not produce inner mastery. Alignment did. This humility prevents arrogance, which can reintroduce fear through overconfidence and collapse. Guided humility maintains balance. The individual's inner dialogue now reflects certainty without rigidity. There is openness to correction, but no openness to doubt. This distinction is crucial. Doubt questions purpose. Correction refines execution. Fear confuses the two. Guidance separates them. The mind becomes teachable without becoming uncertain. Hill taught that the ultimate test of mastery is consistency under success. Many can persist under hardship. Few can remain disciplined when comfort increases. Success can dull urgency. It can invite complacency. Fear sometimes returns disguised as entitlement or distraction. God's guidance counters this by maintaining purpose as central regardless of circumstance. At this stage, success is no longer pursued for validation. It is pursued because it is the natural expression of alignment. The individual works because work is obedience. Persistence continues because stopping would violate identity. Fear cannot interrupt this flow because there is no internal debate to exploit. The invisible forces that shape destiny now operate through the individual rather than around them. Intuition becomes faster, insight becomes sharper, timing becomes precise. This is not mystical superiority. It is mental coherence. When thought, emotion, and action align, the mind functions as a unified instrument. Fear cannot exist in a unified mind. It requires division. It requires internal conflict. It requires doubt-battling desire. Guidance resolves conflict by establishing a single authority. Purpose answers to law. Action answers to purpose. Emotion answers to action. The hierarchy is clear. The individual now understands that freedom from fear was never the goal. Alignment was. Fear simply dissolves as a byproduct of alignment. This realization prevents obsession with fear itself. Attention remains on execution, contribution, and mastery. This is the threshold where success ceases to be something pursued and becomes something expressed. And the individual steps forward, not because fear is gone, but because guidance is absolute. There is a final internal resistance that appears just before the full integration of guidance into identity. It is subtle, deeply ingrained, and rarely acknowledged. Napoleon Hill understood this resistance as the last defense of the undisciplined self, the desire to retain partial control. Fear at earlier stages demanded safety. At this stage, fear demands autonomy without accountability. It wants the benefits of guidance without the surrender required to sustain it. This is where many stall permanently, mistaking partial alignment for mastery. God's guidance at this depth is not compatible with selective obedience. The mind cannot follow higher intelligence only when convenient. Law does not operate conditionally. Hill observed that those who achieve enduring success eventually abandon the illusion that they can outthink principle. They stop attempting to negotiate outcomes. They commit fully to cause, trusting effect to follow in its own time. Fear resists this surrender because surrender feels like loss of control. In truth, it is the transfer of control from impulse to order. This stage demands the death of the old self-image. The individual must relinquish the identity that was built around struggle, doubt, and emotional volatility. Fear often clings to identity more fiercely than to outcome. It whispers that without tension, vigilance, and anxiety, one will lose edge, ambition, or drive. Hill dismantled this illusion completely. He demonstrated that fear does not sharpen performance, it fragments it. True intensity comes from purpose, not pressure. God's guidance replaces force with flow, not ease, but coherence. Effort continues, but friction decreases. The individual begins to notice that resistance now comes primarily from within, not from circumstance. External obstacles still exist, but they no longer feel antagonistic. They feel procedural. This shift marks the near-complete removal of AR's emotional charge. At this stage, the mind becomes profoundly honest with itself. Self-deception is no longer tolerable. Rationalizations are exposed quickly. Excuses are recognized as fear wearing intellectual clothing. Hill emphasized that self-honesty is one of the highest forms of discipline. Without it, guidance becomes distorted. With it, clarity becomes ruthless and liberating. The guided individual now experiences desire differently. Burning desire remains, but it is purified. It is no longer frantic or desperate. It does not seek fulfillment to escape inadequacy. It seeks fulfillment to express alignment. This distinction is critical. Desire rooted in lack feeds fear. Desire rooted in purpose feeds persistence. God's guidance transforms desire from hunger into direction. Faith at this stage is no longer something the individual practices. It is something the individual inhabits. Doubt may still pass through the mind, but it does not linger. It is observed and dismissed without emotional engagement. Fear cannot gain momentum because momentum requires attention. The guided mind does not grant it. Autosuggestion continues, but now it operates at a deeper level. Affirmations are no longer repetitive statements spoken against doubt. They are confirmations spoken from certainty. The subconscious no longer resists them. It recognizes alignment. Behavior flows naturally from belief. Discipline feels internal rather than imposed. Hill taught that persistence reaches its highest form when it no longer feels heroic. It becomes routine. The individual does not admire their own endurance. They simply continue. Fear loses its final leverage here. It cannot intimidate routine. It cannot dramatize consistency. Persistence without drama starves fear completely. Imagination at this stage becomes integrative. It connects long-term vision with daily execution seamlessly. There is no disconnect between aspiration and action. The individual no longer fantasizes about distant success while avoiding present discipline. Each day is treated as an expression of destiny in progress. Fear thrives on separation between who one is and who one wants to be. Guidance dissolves that separation. Decision-making now reflects unity of mind. There is no inner argument, no second-guessing, no emotional hangover after choice. Decisions are made, acted upon, and absorbed into forward motion. Fear cannot survive without regret and rumination. When the mind moves cleanly from decision to action, fear has no terrain. Hill emphasized that at this level, the individual must guard against complacency disguised as peace. Inner calm is not permission to disengage. It is capacity to engage more fully. Fear once used anxiety to keep the individual alert. Guidance replaces anxiety with awareness. Awareness is quieter but far more precise. The guided individual now understands that responsibility does not end with personal success. Influence expands naturally. Others observed it. The composure, the discipline, the consistency. Guidance begins to operate through example. This is where fear of criticism might attempt a final resurgence. Visibility increases vulnerability. Hill warned that fear of criticism is the last fear to die. God's guidance confronts it by anchoring action in duty rather than approval. Criticism loses power when purpose is clear. Praise loses power as well. The individual becomes internally referenced. Standards are self-imposed and principled. Fear cannot manipulate behavior through external opinion when the internal compass is fixed. The invisible forces Hill spoke of now feel less like external support and more like internal synchronization. Timing improves. Choices align. Energy is conserved. The individual feels carried not by emotion but by order. This is often described as being in the flow, but Hill understood it as alignment with infinite intelligence. Fear once fractured energy, scattering it across imagined threats. Guidance concentrates energy. Focus deepens. Effort intensifies without strain. This concentrated energy produces results that appear effortless to observers. They mistake it for talent or luck. The individual recognizes it as obedience. At this stage, setbacks still occur, but they no longer destabilize identity or purpose. The mind adjusts without emotional collapse. Strategy changes without self-condemnation. Fear cannot weaponize failure when failure is not personalized. Hill insisted that failure only becomes destructive when it is interpreted as identity rather than instruction. The individual now sees clearly that fear was never an enemy to be fought, but a symptom to be outgrown. Each stage of growth rendered a former fear obsolete. Fear of poverty faded with understanding of value creation. Fear of failure faded with persistence. Fear of criticism faded with self-definition. Fear of death of the old self fades now with acceptance of full responsibility. God's guidance demands maturity. It does not comfort childish dependency. It empowers adult agency. The individual no longer asks for signs. They act on principle. They no longer seek reassurance. They seek alignment. Fear cannot survive in a mind that no longer seeks permission to be itself. Hill believed that this stage marks the transformation from seeker to builder. The individual stops searching for answers and begins applying laws. Application replaces inquiry. Execution replaces contemplation. Fear thrives in endless preparation. Guidance thrives in action. The subconscious mind at this stage is fully enlisted. Habits operate automatically in service of purpose. Willpower is rarely required because behavior is congruent with identity. Fear, which once hijacked willpower, finds no resistance to exploit. The individual experiences a quiet sense of inevitability that is deeply stabilizing. Not the arrogance of certainty, but the calm of commitment. They know that as long as alignment is maintained, progress is unavoidable. This knowing removes urgency without removing intensity. It allows patience without passivity. Hill taught that those who reach this level often feel a profound internal stillness. This stillness is not emptiness, it is order. Fear requires noise. Guidance produces silence. In silence, intuition is clear. In silence, decision is swift. In silence, purpose is unmistakable. The final remnants of fear attempt to return through nostalgia. The old identity feels familiar. Struggle feels known. Guidance requires stepping fully into the unfamiliar calm of mastery. The individual must resist romanticizing past chaos. Growth is not dramatic, it is consistent. At this point, fear has been psychologically disarmed, emotionally neutralized, and behaviorally replaced. It may still exist conceptually, but it no longer functions as a governing force. The mind operates under a single directive, alignment with law. The individual stands now on the edge of complete ownership of life and purpose. Nothing external can grant or revoke this state. It is earned internally and maintained through discipline. Only one step remains, and it demands total commitment. There is a moment when guidance stops feeling like something you follow and becomes something you embody. This is the final crossing. Napoleon Hill understood that at the highest level of inner mastery, success is no longer pursued as a destination, but lived as a discipline. The mind no longer asks what will happen next. It asks only one question. Am I fully aligned right now, in this moment, with the law that governs my purpose? This is where God's guidance completes its work on fear, not by eliminating uncertainty, not by guaranteeing outcomes, but by establishing an inner authority so absolute that uncertainty loses its power to intimidate. Fear cannot exist where authority is settled. It can only survive where responsibility is evaded. At this final stage, there is no evasion left. The individual now understands a truth that once felt unbearable. There is no external force responsible for their life. Not circumstance, not luck, not other people, not even fear. There is only alignment or misalignment, action or avoidance, discipline or drift. God's guidance does not soften this truth. It sharpens it. And in that sharpness, fear collapses completely because fear depends on excuses to survive. Hill taught that the final enemy is not fear itself, but divided commitment. A mind that is partially devoted is always vulnerable. It leaves cracks for doubt, hesitation, and retreat. God's guidance demands unity, one purpose, one standard, one direction. When the mind becomes unified, fear loses the internal conflict it needs to operate. There is nothing left to argue with. At this level, faith is no longer emotional or even intellectual. It is structural. It is built into how decisions are made, how effort is sustained, how setbacks are interpreted, how time is respected. Faith becomes the architecture of the mind. Fear cannot dismantle architecture. It can only rattle loose structures. The individual now recognizes that fear once provided a false sense of depth. Anxiety felt like seriousness. Worry felt like responsibility. Tension felt like commitment. God's guidance exposes this illusion completely. True depth is calm. True responsibility is action. True commitment is consistency. Fear was never proof of caring. It was proof of lack of control. The mind guided at this level is ruthless with itself, but never cruel. It does not indulge weakness, but it does not condemn error. It corrects. It adjusts. It persists. Fear once turned mistakes into identity. Guidance turns mistakes into instruction. This single shift removes the final emotional leverage fear ever held. Now the individual understands something that once seemed paradoxical. Surrender was the gateway to power. Not surrender to people, not surrender to circumstance, surrender to law, to principle, to purpose, to the discipline of thought and action aligned with higher intelligence. Fear frames surrender as weakness because fear equates control with force. Guidance reveals that control comes from alignment. The invisible mental forces Hill described are now experienced as internal coherence rather than external intervention. Thought produces action. Action produces result. Result produces feedback. Feedback refines thought. The loop is complete. Fear once disrupted this loop with hesitation and doubt. Guidance now keeps it closed and efficient. This is where destiny stops being imagined and starts being executed. The individual no longer waits for clarity to act. Action creates clarity. They no longer wait for confidence to move. Movement produces confidence. They no longer wait for fear to disappear. Alignment renders fear irrelevant. Hill insisted that success at this level demands absolute responsibility. No blame, no complaint, no retreat into victimhood. God's guidance does not support the weak-minded, but it empowers the disciplined. This is not cruelty. It is respect. Respect for the individual's capacity to govern themselves. The individual now sees clearly that every moment is a vote for alignment or drift, a vote for discipline or indulgence, a vote for pose or distraction. Fear once influenced these votes through emotion. Guidance now governs them through principle. The mind votes the same way every day because identity has been decided. This is the death of procrastination. Procrastination was fear pretending to be patience. It was fear asking for more time to negotiate surrender. Now there is nothing to negotiate. The individual acts because action is who they are. Delay feels unnatural. Inaction feels like disobedience. God's guidance has removed fear not by shielding the individual from consequence, but by making consequence meaningful. Pain no longer terrifies because pain is no longer pointless. Effort no longer exhausts because effort is no longer scattered. Sacrifice no longer feels like loss because sacrifice serves purpose. The individual stands now fully exposed to life without armor and yet completely unafraid. Not because nothing can hurt them, but because nothing can divert them. Fear relied on diversion, on distraction, on emotional chaos. Guidance has eliminated chaos by establishing order. This is the state Hill observed in those who achieved greatness that endured. They were not frantic, they were not desperate, they were not reactive, they were deliberate, grounded, unyielding. Their strength did not come from intensity of emotion, but from clarity of mind. At this final stage, the individual understands that God's guidance was never about protection from the world. It was about preparation to face fully. Fear wanted escape. Guidance demanded engagement. Fear wanted certainty before action. Guidance demanded action before certainty. Now there is no turning back because the individual has seen too clearly. They know fear was never truth. It was habit. They know guidance was never distant. It was always available, waiting for discipline to make the mind quiet enough to hear it. This is the moment where excuses end, where half measures are exposed, where comfort is revealed as the most expensive indulgence of all. Hill believed that life eventually confronts every person with this moment. Most turn away, a few step forward. Stepping forward now means something precise. It means deciding without reservation that your mind will no longer be a battleground, that your thoughts will no longer be random, that your emotions will no longer dictate your actions, that your purpose will no longer be negotiable. It means accepting that fear may still appear, but it will never decide. It will never delay. It will never rule. It means committing to daily alignment, daily discipline, daily execution, whether you feel ready or not. It means owning your life without apology. No more waiting for signs. No more waiting for permission. No more waiting for confidence to arrive before action. Confidence is the reward of obedience, not the prerequisite. You are guided now, not because the path is easy, but because you are ready to take full responsibility for walking it. Decide, calm. MIT. Act. Align your thoughts with purpose. Align your actions with discipline. Align your persistence with faith. And refuse from this moment forward to let fear cast another vote in the direction of your life. This is not inspiration. This is instruction. Take control of your mind. Take ownership of your purpose. Take responsibility for your destiny. And move